as they would. I get calls just about every day from somebody asking me, well, you know, we have plans to go here in November, can we go? And so it really does have an impact on the economy of the state of Florida.
All right. Have you observed that red tide has been either more frequent or more severe over these past few years?
So it does come and go interannually. There is not enough systematically collected data to make the argument that it's more or less severe now than it had been in the 1800s. So if you go back in the historical record, and you know, some part of it's more accurate than others, there are lots of anecdotal statements that primarily by fishermen, that the fish were killed or the bait in the bait well was killed. And so we know that there were fish kills. They're documented going back into the 1800s. The chroniclers of De Soto's expedition back in the early 1500s wrote about throat irritation, dead fish, and so on. So it's been with us for a long, long time. It's nothing new. As we started making more scientific observations of the creature, we tended to do that as an event response. So if somebody complained about red tide, an agency person would go and collect some water, look at a microscope and say, ah, it's a bloom. And so as time has gone on and the population of Florida has increased and the agencies have gotten more personnel, we tend to make more observations. So if you just look at the observations that were made, you might conclude, it's getting more prevalent. Well, no, the data don't suggest that at all. It just suggests that we've been sampling it more, and there's more people, so more people complain about it. So we don't know. That's the true answer to it, but it's a good question. We know that the sugar industry began in Florida, I guess, after Castro took over Cuba, but that wasn't too long ago. We had red tide long before the sugar industry grew in Florida. Agriculture in Florida has blossomed over that same period of time. But again, we had red tide long before that. So that's an open question. We really don't know. Although it's a very good question. You might surmise that if you keep throwing more, if you already have a bloom and you keep feeding it with more nutrients, it stands to reason that maybe that will have an impact, but we really don't know.
So you mentioned the sugar industry and the agriculture industry. How do they deal with the red tide, and how do they affect all of this?
Well, there was an editorial piece maybe 3-4 weeks ago by one of the CEOs of the sugar industry, and he basically said that that they're not contributing to it, and he may be correct. I don't know. I'm not going to challenge it. I'd like to think that they are taking steps to mitigate the flow of nutrients from their activities into the coastal waters, but I don't know. I'm really not attuned to what they're doing.
You're referring to fertilizer runoff, correct?
Yeah, well, it's a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, you have a field of cows, they're pooping on the grass, and so anything you do agriculturally will result in nutrients coming into the coastal water. Whether it's man-applied nutrients or simply the tilling of the soil or the pooping by the cows. It's going to put nutrients into the water.
All right. What do you think that these industries can or perhaps should do to manage the effects of red tide, or is there anything that anyone can do to manage the effects?
That's a wonderful question. The key, I think, and the easiest thing to do to make improvements to ecology is to simply conserve as best one can. I mean, let's take putting carbon into the atmosphere. If 1/3 of a barrel of oil goes to making gasoline, if we simply double the gasoline mileage that we get from an automobile, we save 1/6 of a barrel of oil. That is probably the simplest, most effective way of conserving fossil fuels. I mean, 1/6 is, what is that, 16, 17, 18%. You're not going to do better than that with solar panels or windmills. So, simple conservation, being more efficient in how we utilize our resources, is the most effective way of mitigating what we might think is an anthropogenic hazard. And so, the agricultural industry can follow those same guidelines, and they would save money in the process. Now, the Army Corps of Engineers are the ones that engineer our waterways. They're the ones that control Lake Okeechobee. We've been talking about the threat of levees breaking in Lake Okeechobee now for as long as I've been here in Florida. And what's been done? I'll ask you. Not much. And so that could be fixed. We just need to have the political will to do it. So it's very easy to throw blame. It's a little more difficult to actually find solutions. And when you think about it, those solutions don't have to be very difficult ones. You just have to have the will to do it.
All right. What might be some of the short and long-term consequences if we failed to enact some of these solutions and we failed to ineffectively manage or control red tide?
Well, again, red tide has been with us forever. The ecosystem has adapted and evolved to deal with red tide. So eradicating red tide is not going to, it's going to have a consequence, and it may have an unintended consequence, which might be a lot worse than the red tide itself. So doing nothing actually just leaves us in the situation we've been in forever, and that might be the best thing to do. Now, as population increases, it becomes an ever-increasing nuisance, and it does have an economic impact on the state, but in terms of the ecology, I don't know if it has any impact on the state. So we have to balance, how does nature really work versus what would we like to see as human beings. And before we do any environmental engineering, we better make sure we understand how that process actually works, what its role is in nature, before we do something we may seriously regret. And somebody had the bright idea that bringing Brazilian pepper into Florida was a good idea. It wasn't. Somebody had the bright idea that bringing Australian pine and Melaleuca trees was a good idea. It really wasn't. And so you can go and think about all these various ecological engineering experiments that have been performed, and I challenge you to find a couple that were good.
All right. That concludes my questions. Is there anything else that you would like to say about red tide or the topic in general?
So like anything else, we need to understand something before we can really manage it or make reasonable managerial decisions. And so I always like to say you can't fix something if you don't know how it works. And you can't restore something if you don't know what it was to begin with. And we make a lot of noise about this phenomenon called red tide. We need to back up some of that noise with the resources and the commitment to learn more about it, so that in the future we may make decisions that are good ones versus bad ones.
Thank you for your time.
Okay.
All right.